This is the fourth part of the first chapter I'm reading. It's all about when Julia arrived, Ross and Demelza's daughter, and I'm going to try and read this as the final part. He had finished the grilled kidneys and the roast ham, and was wondering whether to take a little of the smoked cod before it was carried away to be kept warm for his wife, who would breakfast in bed later. The early ride had made him very hungry, and he had set up a great commotion because breakfast was not waiting when he returned. Choke believed servants should not be allowed to get fat and lazy. The loud knocking on the front door was hardly to be heard above the thunder of the wind. "If that is anyone for me, Nancy," he said testily, lowering his eyebrows, "I am from home." "Yes, sir." He decided after a sniff to take some of the cod, and was irritated that it was necessary to help himself. This done, he settled his stomach against the table, and had swallowed the first knifeful when there was an apologetic cough behind him. "Begging your pardon, sir, Captain Poldark." "Tell him." Dr. Choke looked up and saw in the mirror a tall, dripping figure behind his harassed maid. Ross came into the room. He had lost his hat and torn the lace on the sleeves of his coat. Water followed him in a trail across Dr. Choke's best Turkey carpet. But there was something in his eyes which prevented Choke from noticing this. The Poldarks had been Cornish gentlemen for 200 years, and Choke, for all his airs, came from dubious stock. He got up. "I disturb your breakfast," said Ross. "Is something wrong?" "You'll remember," said Ross, "that I engaged you to be with my wife in her lying in." "Well, she's going on well. I made a thorough examination. The child will be born this afternoon. I engaged you as a surgeon to be in the house, not as a travelling peddler." Choke went white round the lips. He turned on the gaping Nancy. "Get Captain Poldark some port." Nancy fled. "What's your complaint?" Choke made an effort to outstare his visitor. The fellow had no money and was still a mere youngster. "We have attended your father, your uncle, your cousin, and his wife, your cousin Verity. They have never found reason to call my treatment in question. What they do is their own affair. Where is your cloak? Man, I can't ride out in this gale of wind. Look at yourself. It would be impossible to sit a horse. You should have thought of that when you left Nampara." The door opened and Polly Choke came in with her hair in pins and wearing a flowing cerise morning gown. She gave a squeal when she saw Ross. "Oh, Captain Poldark, I'd no idea, really, to see you like this. But the wind upstairs, faith, it upset one to hear it. I fear for the wolf, Tom, that I do. And if it came in on my head, I should be a pretty sight." "You're not a pretty sight peeping round the door," snapped her husband irritably. "Come in or go out as you please, but have the goodness to decide." Polly pouted and came in, and looked at Ross sidelong and patted her hair. The door slammed behind her. "I never get used to your old Cornish winds, and this is a fair demon. Jenkins says there is 5 slates off the battery, and I doubt there not be more. How is your wife, Captain Poldark?" Choke slipped off his skull cap and put on his wig. "That will not stand the wind," said Ross. "You're not going out, Tom, but you should not ride and scarcely walk, and think of the danger of falling trees." "Captain Poldark is nervous for his wife," Choke said whitely. "But surely it is urgent, those noons again. I remember my mother said I was 8 and 40 hours a-coming." "Then your husband will be 8 and 40 hours a-waiting," said Ross. "It is a whim I have, Mrs. Choke." Pettishly the surgeon flung off his purple-spotted morning gown and pulled on his tailcoat. Then he stamped out to get his bag and his riding cloak, nearly upsetting Nancy, who was coming in with the port. The wind was a little abeam of them on the return. Choke lost his wig and his hat, but Ross caught the wig and stuffed it under his coat. By the time they climbed the rise near Wheel Maiden, they were both gasping and drenched. As they reached the trees, they saw a slight figure in a grey cloak ahead of them. "Verity," said Ross, as they overtook her leaning against a tree, "you have no business out today." She gave him her wide-mouthed, generous smile. "You should know it can't be kept a secret. Mrs. Zacky's Betty saw Judd and Dr. Choke on her way to the mine, and she told Bartle's wife." Verity leaned her wet face against the tree. "Our cowshed is down, and we have the 2 cows in the brewhouse. The headgear of Diggory's mine has collapsed, but I think no one is hurt. How is she, Ross?" "Well enough, I trust." Ross linked his arm in Verity's, and they began to walk after the stumbling, cloak-blown figure of the physician. He had often thought that if a man were allowed a second wife, he would have asked his cousin for her kindness and generosity, and for the soothing effect she always had on him. Already he was beginning to feel shamefaced at his own anger. Tom Choke had his good points, and naturally knew his job better than Mrs. Zacky Martin. They caught up with Choke as he was climbing over the fallen elm branches. 2 of the apple trees were down, and Ross wondered what Demelza would say when she saw the remnants of her spring flowers. When she did, he quickened his pace. Some of the irritation returned at the thought of all the women milling about in the house, and his beloved Demelza helpless and in pain, and Choke going off without a word. As they entered, they saw Ginny pattering up the stairs with a basin of steaming water, slopping some of it into the hall in her haste. She never even looked at them. Dr. Choke was so distressed that he went into the parlour and sat on the first chair and tried to get his breath. He glared at Ross and said, "I'll thank you for my wig." Ross poured out 3 glasses of brandy. He took the first to Verity, who had collapsed in a chair, her fluffy dark hair contrasting with the wet streaks where the hood had not covered it. She smiled at Ross and said, "I will go upstairs when Dr. Choke is ready. Then if all goes well, I will get you something to eat." Choke gulped down his brandy and passed his glass for more. Ross, knowing that liquor made him a better doctor, gave it him. "We will breakfast together," Choke said, more cheerful at the thought of food. "We will just go up and set everyone's mind at rest. Then we will breakfast. What have you for breakfast?" Verity got up. Her cloak fell away and showed the plain grey dimity frock, the bottom 8 inches embroidered with mud and rain. But it was at her face that Ross looked. She wore a full, uplifted, startled expression, as if she had seen a vision. "What is it?" "Ross, I thought I heard." They all listened. "Oh," said Ross harshly, "there are children in the kitchen. There are children in the still room, and children, for all I know, in the clothes closet. Every age and size." Verity said, "Shh." Choke fumbled for his bag. All his movements were clumsy, and he made a great deal of noise. "That is not a grown child," Verity said suddenly. "That is not a grown child." They listened again. "We must go to our patient," said Choke, suddenly ill at ease and faintly sly. "We shall be ready for breakfast when we come down." He opened the door. The others followed him, but at the foot of the stairs they all stopped. Prudy was on the top step. She was still wearing her night shift, with a coat over it, and her great figure bulged like an overfull sack. She bent to look at them, her long pink face bulbous and shining. "We've done it!" she shouted in her organ voice. "'Tes a girl! We gotten a girl for 'ee! Handsomest little mite I ever saw! We knocked her face about a small bit, but her's as lusty as a little nebby coat. Hear her screeching!" After a moment's silence, Choke cleared his throat portentously and put his foot on the bottom step, but Ross pushed him aside and went up the stairs first. That's the end of chapter 1 from Demelza. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed reading it to you. And this book I saw on the internet for £30 when I bought it. Guess how much it was? It was only £13. Oh, I don't know if you can see that. £13.90. So it's now worth £30, my goodness me. Okay, but it's a great book, and I've read it so many times. That's why I find it easy to read it to you. Thank you for the pleasure. Good evening.